The gunshot that killed Dahlia's husband echoed across the Montana plains just as the first snow began to fall. And she knew in that terrible instant that everything she had believed about her life was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. The outlaws who ambushed their wagon took everything except her life, perhaps because she looked more dead than alive already, collapsed in the mud with Thomas's blood seeping into the earth beside her. They left her there with a dying horse, an overturned wagon, and the realization that the man she had married 6 months ago in St. Louis had been running from debts she never knew existed. Dahlia Brennan was 22 years old, and the world had just shown her its cruelest face. She sat in the mud for what might have been hours, watching Thomas's eyes go empty, feeling the November cold seep through her traveling dress. The horse, a mare named Bess, lay 20 feet away with a bullet in her side, breathing in ragged gasps. Dahlia found herself crawling to the animal, pressing her face against the warm neck, whispering nonsense words while they both shivered. She might have frozen there if not for the sound of hoofbeats. Her first thought was that the outlaws had returned, and she felt nothing but a dull acceptance. Death seemed almost welcome after everything else. But the rider who appeared through the thickening snow was not one of the men who had destroyed her life an hour before. He sat tall in his saddle, a dark figure against the white sky, and when he dismounted, his movements were careful, deliberate, as though he were approaching a wounded animal that might bolt. "Madam," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Are you hurt?" Dahlia looked up at him. He was perhaps 25, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of slate. His face was weathered beyond his years, marked with old scars along his jawline. He wore a heavy coat and leather gloves, and his horse was a sturdy buckskin that looked better fed than most people Dahlia had seen in recent weeks. "My husband," she managed to say, gesturing toward where Thomas lay. "They killed him. They took everything." The cowboy walked to Thomas, knelt, checked for a pulse even though it was obvious there was none. Then he moved to the horse, and Dahlia heard the soft words he spoke before the single gunshot that ended Bess's suffering. She flinched at the sound but felt grateful that someone had the mercy to do what needed doing. He came back to her, extending a gloved hand. "Name's Owen Quinn. I have a place about 5 miles north of here, near Lusk, Wyoming, just over the border. You cannot stay out here." Dahlia stared at his hand for a long moment. She had been raised in Philadelphia, educated in a proper girls' school, taught that accepting help from strange men was improper. But propriety seemed like a luxury from another lifetime, something that had died with Thomas in the mud. She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Her legs barely held her weight, and she swayed. Owen caught her elbow, steadying her with an impersonal efficiency that somehow made it easier to accept his help. "We need to bury him," she said. "Ground's too hard already, and there's a storm coming. I will come back tomorrow with proper tools and do right by him, but you will freeze to death if you stay out here another hour." Dahlia wanted to argue, but the wind was picking up, and her teeth had started to chatter so hard she could barely speak. Owen walked her to his horse, lifted her into the saddle with surprising gentleness, and then mounted behind her. He wrapped his coat around both of them, and she felt the solid warmth of his chest against her back as they rode north through the falling snow. She must have passed out at some point, because the next thing she remembered was being carried into a small cabin. The warmth inside hit her like a physical force, and she gasped. Owen set her down in a chair near a pot-bellied stove and began working to get her out of her wet clothes with the brisk efficiency of someone who had dealt with frostbite before. "I can manage," she said weakly, but her fingers would not cooperate. "No, you cannot," he said bluntly. He stripped off her sodden dress and wrapped her in a thick wool blanket, then set about making coffee. The cabin was small, maybe 15 feet by 20, with a single room that served as kitchen, living space, and bedroom. There was one bed against the far wall, a table with 2 chairs, the stove, and shelves stocked with supplies. Everything was neat and organized in a way that suggested a man who lived alone and took care with his space. Owen poured coffee into a tin cup and pressed it into her hands, guiding it to her lips when she could not seem to manage the motion herself. The liquid was bitter and scalding, and it burned all the way down, but it brought her back to herself in painful increments. "You should drink all of it," he said. "Then I have stew from yesterday. You need food." Dahlia obeyed because she could not think clearly enough to do anything else. Owen moved around the cabin with economical movements, heating the stew, setting a bowl in front of her, watching to make sure she ate. He did not ask questions, and she was grateful for that. She did not think she could speak about what had happened without falling apart completely. When she had finished eating, exhaustion hit her like a sledgehammer. Owen looked at her for a moment, then at his bed, then back at her. "You take the bed," he said. "I will make a pallet on the floor." "I cannot take your bed," Dahlia protested weakly. "You can and you will. You have been through hell today, and you need proper rest." His tone left no room for argument. Dahlia was too tired to fight. She let him guide her to the bed, and she collapsed onto it, still wrapped in the blanket. She was asleep before he had finished laying out his bedroll on the floor near the stove. She woke in darkness to the sound of the wind howling around the cabin walls. For a moment, she could not remember where she was, and panic seized her. Then she heard the quiet sound of breathing from across the room and remembered. Owen. The cabin. Thomas was dead. She pressed her face into the pillow and cried as silently as she could, but in a space that small, nothing was truly silent. She heard Owen shift on the floor, heard him get up, and then felt the weight of another blanket being laid over her. He did not speak, did not touch her beyond that, just added the blanket and returned to his bedroll. Somehow that simple kindness made her cry harder. The storm lasted 3 days. Owen went out periodically to care for his horse and check his small stock of animals: 2 cows, a handful of chickens, and a pig he kept in a lean-to attached to the cabin. Each time he came back in, he brought a blast of cold air and snow that had drifted up past the windows. They were well and truly snowed in. On the second day, Dahlia felt strong enough to help with simple tasks. Owen had given her an old shirt and pair of trousers that he cinched with a belt at her waist. They were far too large, but they were clean and dry, and she was grateful. She helped him cook, washed the dishes in a basin of heated water, and tried not to think about the fact that she was utterly dependent on a stranger's charity. Owen did not talk much. He moved through the cabin like a man used to solitude, but he was not unkind. When she asked him questions, he answered in brief sentences. He had been working this homestead for 3 years. He had cattle pastured in the hills that he would need to check on once the storm cleared. He had no family, no wife, no children. The land was his, bought with money he had saved from years of cowboying for other outfits. "Why here?" Dahlia asked on the 3rd day, when the storm had finally begun to ease. They were sitting at the table, eating breakfast, and she had been watching him eat in silence for long enough that she needed to hear a human voice. Owen looked up from his plate, surprised by the question. "Why anywhere? Land was available. It is decent grazing. Water is good." "Do you not get lonely?" Something flickered across his face, too quick for her to read. "Loneliness is better than a lot of other things." Dahlia did not push. She understood that sentiment better than she would have a week ago. On the 4th day, Owen dug Thomas out from under 2 feet of snow and brought him back wrapped in canvas. Dahlia stood beside him in the bitter cold while he dug a grave in a spot near a stand of bare cottonwoods. The ground was frozen, and it took him hours, working in shifts to avoid exhaustion. Dahlia tried to help, but he waved her back to the cabin. "You will freeze," he said, "and I am nearly done." She went back inside but watched through the window as he finished. When he came to get her, she walked out in her borrowed clothes and stood beside the grave while Owen lowered Thomas into the ground. She tried to think of something to say, some prayer or eulogy, but her mind was blank. Thomas had been her husband for 6 months, and she realized she had never really known him at all. "He was not a bad man," she finally said, "just a foolish one." Owen nodded and began filling in the grave. When he was finished, he made a simple cross from 2 pieces of wood and planted it at the head. Dahlia stood there for a few more minutes, feeling the cold seep through her coat, and then she turned and walked back to the cabin. She did not cry. She felt hollowed out, empty of everything except a dull ache that might have been grief or might have been relief that the lie of her marriage was finally over. That night, Owen made a proposition. "Winter is here," he said, not looking at her, his eyes on the fire in the stove. "You have nowhere to go, and the nearest town is Lusk, which is 8 miles from here. Even if you made it there, you have no money, no resources. You would be dependent on charity, and charity runs thin in winter." Dahlia waited, her hands folded in her lap for him to continue. "You can stay here until spring. Help with the work, and I will provide room and board. When the weather breaks, I will take you to Lusk or wherever you want to go. I will give you money for a train ticket back east if that is what you want." "Why would you do that?" she asked. Owen was quiet for a long moment. "Because leaving you to freeze or starve would make me no better than the men who killed your husband, and because I could use the help. Winter is hard out here alone." "People will talk," Dahlia said. "A woman living with a man she is not married to." "There is no one close enough to talk. My nearest neighbor is 12 miles away, and I see him maybe twice a year. What people in Lusk think does not concern me much." Dahlia considered this. She had no illusions about her options. Owen was right. She had nothing. Going to Lusk would mean throwing herself on the mercy of strangers, and there was no guarantee anyone would help her. At least here she would be useful. At least here she would have shelter and food. "All right," she said. "Until spring." Owen nodded once, a short, sharp motion, and that was that. The days fell into a rhythm. Dahlia woke before dawn and started the fire, put coffee on to boil, and began breakfast while Owen went out to tend the animals. He came back in when the food was ready, and they ate in companionable silence. After breakfast, there was always work. Dahlia washed clothes, mended tears in fabric, organized supplies, cooked and cleaned. Owen chopped wood, checked on the cattle when the weather allowed, repaired tools and tack, and did the 100 other tasks that kept a homestead running. They spoke little beyond what was necessary. Owen was not a man given to small talk, and Dahlia found she did not mind. She had spent her whole life in places where words were cheap and plentiful, where silence was uncomfortable. Here, silence felt restful. But there was one source of awkwardness that neither of them addressed. The cabin had only one bed, and though Owen had insisted she take it, Dahlia could see that sleeping on the floor was taking a toll on him. He was stiff in the mornings, moving carefully until his muscles warmed up. She saw him pressing a hand to his lower back when he thought she was not looking. 3 weeks after she arrived, Dahlia made a decision. "We should share the bed," she said one evening after supper. Owen looked at her sharply. "That is not necessary. You are hurting your back sleeping on the floor. The bed is large enough for 2 people. We can sleep on opposite sides, and it will be warmer for both of us anyway." "It would not be proper," Owen said, and there was something almost amusing about this rough cowboy suddenly concerned with propriety. "Propriety is not keeping us warm," Dahlia replied. "We are both adults. We can manage to share a bed without impropriety." Owen looked like he wanted to argue, but after a moment he gave a short nod. "Opposite sides," he said firmly. "Opposite sides," Dahlia agreed. That night they lay down with a careful distance between them, Owen facing the wall and Dahlia facing the door. The bed was just wide enough that they could manage this without touching, though the division of the blankets was awkward. Dahlia lay stiffly, hyper-aware of Owen's presence 2 feet away, listening to his breathing gradually slow and deepen. She had not shared a bed with anyone since Thomas died. The memories of her brief marriage were painful in ways she had not expected. Thomas had been enthusiastic but clumsy in his affections, and there had been more discomfort than pleasure in their intimate moments. Still, she had been fond of him, or thought she had been. Now she wondered if she had just been fond of the idea of marriage, of the security it represented, lying in the darkness next to Owen, a man who was almost a stranger, felt strange and unsettling, but not frightening. Owen had been nothing but respectful in the weeks she had been here. He had never looked at her with anything but distant courtesy, had never made her feel unsafe. Still, it took her a long time to fall asleep that first night. December arrived with bitter cold and more snow. The days grew shorter and the work became harder. Owen went out every few days to check on his cattle, sometimes staying gone for hours, coming back covered in snow and ice. Dahlia worried when he was gone, though she told herself it was just practical concern. If something happened to him, she would be stranded here alone, and her chances of survival would be slim. But it was more than that, she admitted to herself as she sat by the window watching for his return one particularly bad afternoon. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to the quiet steadiness of him. Owen was not a man given to grand gestures or pretty words, but he was reliable in a way Thomas never had been. He did what he said he would do. He kept his word. And in the evenings, when they sat by the stove, and she occasionally read aloud from the small collection of books he kept on a shelf, she sometimes caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. One night in mid-December, a blizzard hit with a fury that made the previous storm seem mild. The wind screamed around the cabin, and snow piled against the walls so high that Owen had to dig their way out the next morning just to reach the animals. When he came back in, his face was red with cold, and his hands were shaking. Dahlia pulled him to the stove, stripped off his gloves, and wrapped his hands in a warm cloth. "You should not have gone out in that," she said, and heard the fear in her own voice. "The animals needed tending," Owen said through chattering teeth. "The animals are not worth your life." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them, something neither of them acknowledged aloud. Dahlia felt her heart kick hard in her chest, and she turned away, focusing on making hot coffee, on getting food into him, on anything other than the sudden awareness of how much she had come to depend on this man, not just for survival but for something else, something she was not ready to name. That night, the cold was so intense that even the fire in the stove seemed inadequate. Dahlia lay in bed shivering under every blanket they had, and she could hear Owen doing the same on his side of the bed. The distance between them seemed absurd suddenly, a useless gesture toward propriety when they were both freezing. "This is ridiculous," she said into the darkness. "What is?" Owen's voice was rough with cold. "Lying here freezing when we could share warmth. People do it all the time in winter." "It is practical, nothing more." There was a long silence. Then Owen said, "Are you sure?" I am sure that I cannot feel my toes, and I would rather not lose them to frostbite because we are both too stubborn to acknowledge that sharing body heat makes sense." Another silence, and then she felt Owen shift on the bed. His hand appeared in the space between them, visible in the faint light from the dying fire. "All right," he said. Dahlia rolled toward him, and they met in the middle of the bed. It was awkward at first, trying to find a position that was comfortable. But eventually they settled with Dahlia's back against Owen's chest, his arm around her waist, their legs tangled together under the blankets. The warmth was immediate and intense, and Dahlia felt herself stop shivering almost at once. "Better?" Owen asked, his breath warm against her hair. "Much better," she admitted. They lay like that for a while, not speaking, and Dahlia felt something shift inside her chest. This was different from lying with Thomas. There was no expectation here, no pressure, just warmth and comfort and the simple human need for closeness. Owen's arm around her waist was solid and steady, and she felt safer than she had in months. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. For saving my life, for letting me stay, for being kind when you had no reason to be." Owen was quiet for so long she thought he might have fallen asleep. Then he said, "You are not a burden, Dahlia. I want you to know that." It was the first time he had used her given name, and hearing it in his rough voice made something warm unfurl in her chest. She reached down and placed her hand over his, where it rested on her waist. His fingers tightened slightly, and they fell asleep like that, holding on to each other in the darkness. When Dahlia woke the next morning, she was still in Owen's arms, and the first thing she felt was disappointment when he carefully extracted himself and got up to start the fire. They did not speak about it, but that night, they met in the middle of the bed again without discussion, and the night after that, and the one after that. It became their routine, this careful intimacy that was born of necessity and grew into something else, something neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. The days leading up to Christmas were busy. Owen shot a wild turkey, and Dahlia plucked and dressed it, saving the feathers for a project she had in mind. She had found fabric in Owen's stores and was secretly sewing him a new shirt, working on it during the hours when he was out checking his cattle. She had not celebrated Christmas in years, not properly, but something about this year felt different. She wanted to mark it somehow, to acknowledge that she was still alive, still here, still capable of feeling something other than grief. On Christmas Eve, she made a feast with what they had. The turkey, roasted until the skin was crispy and golden. Biscuits with the last of their butter. Canned peaches she had found in the stores, served in tin bowls and tasting like summer. Owen stared at the spread on the table with something like wonder. "I have not had a meal like this in years," he said. "Then we are overdue for celebration," Dahlia replied. They ate slowly, savoring every bite, and Dahlia found herself watching Owen's face, enjoying the rare expressions of pleasure that crossed it. When they finished, she brought out the shirt she had made, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "I know it is not much," she said, suddenly shy, "but I wanted to give you something." Owen took the package carefully, unwrapped it with slow, deliberate movements, and pulled out the shirt. It was made from sturdy blue fabric, with neat stitching and pearl buttons she had salvaged from one of her own dresses. Owen held it up, examining it, and when he looked at her, his eyes were bright. "This is fine work," he said. "The best shirt I have ever owned, thank you." "You are welcome," Dahlia said, feeling warmth spread through her chest. Owen disappeared into the corner of the cabin and came back with something wrapped in an old cloth. "I have something for you too. It is not as fine as what you made, but I thought you might like it." Dahlia unwrapped the cloth and found a pair of leather gloves, soft and supple, clearly made with care. They were lined with rabbit fur and fit her hands perfectly when she tried them on. "How did you know my size?" she asked. "I paid attention," Owen said simply. They looked at each other across the table, and something unspoken passed between them. Dahlia felt her pulse quicken, felt the air in the cabin change, grow charged. Owen stood and walked to the stove, putting more wood in, though the fire was already burning well. He was nervous, Dahlia realized. This hard, quiet man was nervous around her. "Owen," she said softly. He turned to look at her, and she saw it clearly now, the way he looked at her. Not with the distant courtesy he had maintained for weeks, but with longing, with desire, with something deep and real that made her breath catch. "I should not," he said, though she had not asked him anything. "You have been through terrible things. You are vulnerable. It would be wrong of me to take advantage." "What if you are not taking advantage?" Dahlia stood and walked to him, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "What if I am telling you that I feel it too, whatever this is between us?" "You are grieving," Owen said, but his voice was rough, uncertain. "You are not thinking clearly." "I am thinking more clearly than I have in months." Dahlia reached up and placed her palm against his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath her hand. "Thomas is dead, and I am sorry for that, but I did not love him the way a wife should love a husband. I married him because it seemed like the right thing to do, the safe thing to do, and look where that got me. I am tired of doing what is proper and safe. I am tired of pretending I do not feel things because it would be improper to acknowledge them." "Dahlia," Owen said, and it was a warning and a plea all at once. "Owen," she replied, looking up at him. "Reach for me, please." For a moment he did not move, and Dahlia thought he would refuse, would retreat back into his careful distance. Then his hand came up and cupped her face with such tenderness that tears sprang to her eyes. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not, he kissed her. It was nothing like the kisses she had shared with Thomas. Those had been perfunctory, dutiful. This was fire and longing and a hunger that matched her own. Owen's mouth was gentle at first, then more demanding, and Dahlia opened to him, pressing closer, feeling his arms come around her and pull her tight against his body. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Owen rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he said. "I watch you moving around this cabin, and it is all I can do not to reach for you." "Then stop fighting it," Dahlia said. "Stop fighting this." "I do not want to hurt you." "You will not. Owen, you are the kindest man I have ever known. You saved my life. You gave me shelter when I had nothing. You treat me with respect and gentleness. How could I not come to care for you?" Owen pulled back enough to look into her eyes. "I am not an easy man, Dahlia. I have been alone a long time. I do not know how to be anything else." "Neither do I anymore. We can learn together." He kissed her again, slower this time, sweeter, and Dahlia felt something in her chest crack open, something that had been locked tight since the day Thomas died. When Owen lifted her and carried her to the bed, she did not protest. When he laid her down and covered her body with his own, she welcomed him. And when they came together, it was with a tenderness and passion that made her understand for the first time what intimacy could really be. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the blankets, the cabin dark except for the glow from the stove. Owen traced patterns on her bare shoulder with his fingertips, and Dahlia felt more at peace than she had in longer than she could remember. "What happens in the spring?" she asked quietly. Owen was silent for a moment. "That depends on what you want to happen." "I do not want to leave." She felt him go still beside her. "You mean that?" "I mean it. I know this was supposed to be temporary, but I do not want to go back east. There is nothing for me there. And here with you, I feel like I could build something real, something that matters." Owen rolled onto his side, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her. In the faint light, his face was serious. Life out here is hard, Dahlia. Winters are brutal. The work never ends. It is not the comfortable life you would have had back east. The comfortable life back east was a lie. I would rather have a hard truth. Then stay, Owen said simply. Stay and be my partner in this. Stay and help me build this place into something good. Stay and let me love you the way you deserve to be loved. Dahlia felt tears slip down her temples into her hair. Yes, she said. Yes to all of it. Owen kissed her then, soft and sweet, and Dahlia knew that she had found something she had not even known she was looking for. Not just shelter from the storm, but a home. Not just survival, but a reason to live. They spent the rest of that winter getting to know each other in all the ways they had held back from before. Owen taught her to shoot, standing behind her with his arms around her as he showed her how to sight down the barrel of his rifle. Dahlia taught him to read better, patiently working through the old books on his shelf with him in the evenings, praising him when he managed difficult words. They talked more, sharing stories from their pasts, learning each other's histories. Owen told her about growing up in Kansas, about losing his parents to cholera when he was 15, about spending years drifting from ranch to ranch until he had saved enough to buy his own land. He spoke haltingly about the loneliness of those years, about thinking he would spend his whole life alone because he did not know how to be the kind of man women wanted. You are exactly the kind of man I want, Dahlia told him, and watched his face transform with quiet joy. Dahlia told him about Philadelphia, about the suffocating expectations of her family, about feeling like she was drowning in propriety and rules. She told him about meeting Thomas, about thinking he was her escape, only to realize too late that she had traded one cage for another. You are not in a cage here, Owen said. You are free to go any time you want, but I hope you will stay. I will stay, Dahlia promised, for as long as you will have me. January passed into February, and the worst of the winter began to ease. Owen made a trip to Lusk in early March, taking Dahlia with him. It was her first time leaving the cabin since she arrived, and the town, small as it was, felt overwhelming after months of isolation. They bought supplies, and Owen introduced her as his wife, though they were not yet married. Dahlia did not correct him, and the shopkeeper did not question it. On the ride back, Dahlia broached the subject. You called me your wife. I did, Owen said. I should have asked you first. I am sorry. I am not upset. But if we are going to tell people we are married, perhaps we should actually get married. Owen pulled his horse to a stop and turned to look at her. Are you proposing to me, Miss Brennan? Dahlia felt her cheeks heat, but she met his eyes steadily. I suppose I am, Mr. Quinn. What is your answer? Owen's face broke into a grin, the kind of full, open smile she had only seen from him a handful of times. My answer is yes. Absolutely yes. They were married by a circuit preacher who came through Lusk in late March. The ceremony was simple, held in the back room of the general store with the shopkeeper and his wife as witnesses. Dahlia wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Owen bought her, and Owen wore the blue shirt she had made him for Christmas. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Owen kissed her with a sweetness that made the shopkeeper's wife sigh happily. Spring came in earnest in April, bringing green grass and wildflowers and a sense of renewal. Owen's cattle had survived the winter in good shape, and he spent long days riding the range, checking on them, planning for the year ahead. Dahlia worked on expanding their garden, planting vegetables and herbs, determined to make their homestead as self-sufficient as possible. One evening in May, as they sat on the porch Owen had built onto the front of the cabin, watching the sun set over the hills, Dahlia placed her hand over her still flat stomach and said, I think I am with child. Owen's head whipped around. You think? I am fairly certain. I am late, and I have been feeling ill in the mornings." Owen's face went through a series of expressions too quick to catalog, landing finally on something like wonder. "A baby," he said. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy about it?" Dahlia asked, suddenly uncertain. Owen pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "Happy does not begin to cover it. Dahlia, you have given me everything I never knew I wanted. A home, a wife, and now a child. I am the luckiest man alive." Dahlia laughed, relief flooding through her. "We are both lucky." "That we are," Owen agreed, and kissed the top of her head. Their son was born in January of the following year, arriving in the middle of a snowstorm with the help of a midwife from Lusk who barely made it in time. Owen paced outside in the cold while Dahlia labored, and when the midwife finally came out and told him he had a healthy baby boy, he nearly collapsed with relief. They named him James Thomas Quinn, honoring Dahlia's first husband while claiming the boy fully as theirs. Owen held his son with a reverence that made Dahlia's heart ache with love. This hard, quiet man who had saved her life transformed into someone tender and gentle, singing soft lullabies in his rough voice, walking the floor at night when James cried, changing diapers without complaint. "You are a natural father," Dahlia told him one night, watching him rock their son to sleep. "I am just doing what feels right," Owen replied. "Same as everything else with you." Life settled into a new rhythm, busier now with the baby but no less sweet. The homestead prospered. Owen bought more cattle, expanded his grazing range, and built a proper barn to replace the lean-to. Dahlia's garden flourished, and she began selling produce in Lusk, building relationships with the townspeople, becoming part of the community. 2 years after James was born, Dahlia gave birth to twin girls, Grace and Clara. The cabin was too small now, so Owen spent that summer building an addition, adding 2 more rooms and a proper kitchen. The house rang with children's voices, with laughter and occasional tears, and Dahlia could not imagine ever having wanted anything else. One December evening, 11 years after that terrible day when Thomas was killed and Owen found her in the snow, Dahlia stood in the doorway of their house watching her children play in the front yard. James was 12 now, tall and lanky, already helping his father with the cattle. The twins were 9, wild and joyful, always up to some mischief or another. A 4th child, a boy named Matthew, was 5, currently trying to build a snowman with more enthusiasm than skill. Owen came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how strange life is," Dahlia said. "About how the worst day of my life led to all of this. About how I almost died in the snow and instead I found everything I ever needed." "I was thinking about that night too," Owen said. "That first winter, when we were still being so careful around each other. I knew I was falling in love with you, but I did not know if you felt the same. I remember lying on my side of the bed, freezing, wanting to reach for you but not knowing if I should. And then one night I did." "December 20th, Dahlia said. "I remember. It was the night of the blizzard. You remember the exact date?" "Of course I do. It was the night everything changed. The night we stopped pretending this was temporary." She turned in his arms to face him. "You reached for me and I took your hand, and nothing was ever the same after that." Owen cupped her face in his work-roughened hands, his touch as gentle as it had been that first time. "Best decision I ever made." "Mine too," Dahlia said, and kissed him. The children called for them from the yard, wanting help with the snowman, and they went out together into the cold, into the life they had built from tragedy and chance, and a cowboy's decision to reach across a frozen bed for the hand of a woman who had lost everything. Years continued to unfold like the seasons, each bringing its own challenges and joys. James grew into a fine young man who shared his father's quiet steadiness and his mother's quick mind. At 16, he was already taking on more responsibility with the ranch, riding out to check cattle, helping to break horses, learning the business from his father with a diligence that made Owen visibly proud. The twins developed their own distinct personalities despite being identical in appearance. Grace was the dreamer, always with her nose in a book, talking about one day becoming a teacher. Clara was practical and fierce, more interested in learning to rope cattle than in the domestic arts, though Dahlia made sure both girls knew how to run a household. Matthew remained the wild card, charming and mischievous, able to talk his way out of trouble more often than not. The ranch expanded year by year. Owen hired seasonal help during roundup and branding, and the Quinn name became respected throughout Wyoming. Other ranchers sought Owen's advice on breeding stock and land management. Dahlia ran the household and garden with the same efficiency she brought to everything. But she also started teaching reading and arithmetic to children from neighboring ranches who had no school nearby. Their house became a gathering place, a center of community in a region where neighbors could be miles apart. In 1886, a harsh winter decimated many herds in the region, but Owen's careful management and preparation saw them through with minimal losses. While other ranchers struggled, Owen was able to buy out several failing homesteads, significantly increasing their range. The prosperity brought its own challenges. They needed more hands, a bigger house, better organization. "We should build a proper ranch house," Dahlia said one spring evening as they sat on the porch of what had once been a tiny cabin. Extensions and additions had made the house sprawling but somewhat haphazard. Something planned from the beginning, with enough room for everyone and separate spaces for the children as they get older. James will need his own place eventually, and the girls cannot share a room forever. Owen looked at her with that expression he still got sometimes, like he could not quite believe his good fortune. "You want to build something permanent, something that says we are staying." "Owen, we have been here 15 years. We have 4 children. We have cattle and land and a life." "How much more permanent can it get?" "I know," he said. "But sometimes I still wake up and expect to find that this has all been a dream, that I am still alone in that cabin, sleeping on the floor, eating beans from a can." Dahlia reached over and laced her fingers through his. "It is real. We are real, and we are going to build something that will last for generations." They broke ground on the new house that summer. Owen designed it himself, sketching plans by lamplight, measuring and remeasuring, determined to get it right. The house would be 2 stories, built from local stone and timber, with large windows to let in light and a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. There would be a parlor for guests, a real dining room, a kitchen twice the size of what they had now, and 6 bedrooms upstairs. It was ambitious, but Owen approached it with the same steady determination he brought to everything. Construction took 2 years. Owen did much of the work himself with help from his ranch hands and James, who at 17 was already skilled with tools and building. Dahlia watched her son and husband work side by side, seeing how James was becoming his father's true partner, and felt a deep satisfaction. They were building something that would outlast them, a legacy for their children and grandchildren. They moved into the new house in the autumn of 1888, and Dahlia spent weeks arranging furniture, hanging curtains, making each room feel like home. The children ran through the halls, marveling at all the space, claiming their rooms. James took the smallest bedroom, insisting his sisters should have the larger ones, a gallantry that made Dahlia's heart swell. That winter, gathered around the large fireplace in the new parlor, Owen announced that he was officially making James a partner in the ranch. "You are 18 now and you have earned this. The ranch is not just mine anymore. It is ours, and one day it will be yours and your siblings together." James looked overwhelmed, his eyes bright. "I will not let you down, Father. You never have, son, not once." The twins were 15 now, and navigating the complicated transition to young womanhood. Grace had found a position as a teaching assistant in Lusk, riding into town 3 days a week to help at the small schoolhouse that had finally been built. Clara remained on the ranch, working alongside her father and brother, proving herself as capable as any ranch hand despite Owen's initial reservations about his daughter doing such hard work. "She has your stubborn streak," Owen told Dahlia one evening, watching Clara expertly rope a calf that had strayed from the herd. "She has yours," Dahlia replied. "I was never particularly stubborn until I met you." Owen laughed, that full, rich sound that still made Dahlia's heart skip. "You stood in the middle of a snowstorm and told me we should share a bed. I would say that is pretty stubborn." "That was practical, not stubborn. That was the moment I knew I was going to fall in love with you, even though I tried to fight it for weeks after." Dahlia leaned against him, comfortable after all these years, still finding new depths to their relationship. "I am glad you stopped fighting it. So am I. Every single day." In 1889, Wyoming prepared for statehood, and the Quinn Ranch was involved in local meetings and planning. Owen was asked to serve on a council that would represent their county's interests, and though he was reluctant at first, Dahlia encouraged him. "You have a voice people respect," she said. "Use it to help shape what comes next." Owen served for 2 years, traveling occasionally to meetings, always eager to return home. Politics did not suit him the way ranching did, but he took the responsibility seriously, working to ensure that small ranchers had the same protections and opportunities as the big cattle barons. James married in 1891, wedding a rancher's daughter from the next county over. Sarah was a practical, kind young woman who fit seamlessly into the Quinn family. Owen built them a small house on the edge of the ranch property, close enough to be part of things but far enough for privacy. When their first child was born a year later, a boy they named Owen James Quinn, Dahlia held her grandson and felt the circle of life complete itself in the most beautiful way. "We are grandparents," she told Owen that night, lying in bed in the house they had built together. "When did we get old enough for that? Speak for yourself," Owen teased. "I am still young and spry. You are 42. "Exactly. Young." Dahlia laughed and swatted his chest. "You still have gray in your hair." "Distinguished gray," Owen corrected, pulling her closer. "And you love it." "I do," Dahlia admitted. "I love all of you, gray hair and creaking joints and all. My joints do not creak. They will by the time we have a dozen grandchildren." "A dozen?" Owen raised his eyebrows. "You think our children are going to give us a dozen grandchildren, at least?" "Grace is being courted by that young lawyer from Lusk. Clara will marry when she is good and ready, probably to some poor man who does not know what he is getting into. And Matthew is only 14 but already charming every girl within 50 miles. Owen groaned. "Do not remind me. I am going to have to beat suitors away with a stick. Just like you beat them away from me. There were no suitors to beat away. You were mine from the moment I pulled you onto my horse." Dahlia propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him in the lamplight. "Was I really? Even then?" "Maybe not that exact moment," Owen conceded. "But soon after, you fit into my life like you had always been there, like the cabin had just been waiting for you to arrive and make it a home. It was not much of a home before I got there. It was shelter. You made it a home. You made me into someone who could have a home, a family, a life. Before you, I was just going through the motions, surviving but not really living." Dahlia kissed him softly. We saved each other. That we did. Grace married her lawyer in 1893, and they settled in Lusk, where she continued teaching, and he built a small but respectable practice. Clara surprised everyone by announcing her engagement to a cowboy who worked for a neighboring ranch, a quiet man named Thomas Fletcher, who treated her with the respect and partnership she demanded. They married in the spring of 1894, and Owen built them a house on the opposite end of the ranch from James and Sarah. "We are building a compound," Dahlia observed, watching yet another house go up on their land. "We are building a family legacy," Owen corrected. "This land will support all of them and more. By the time we are gone, the Quinn Ranch will be one of the most successful in Wyoming." "When we are gone," Dahlia repeated, "that is still many years away." "I certainly hope so. I am not ready to leave you yet, or this life." They stood together, overlooking the ranch that had grown from a single small cabin and a few head of cattle into a thriving operation. 3 houses now dotted the property, with more undoubtedly to come. Pastures stretched to the horizon, filled with healthy cattle bearing the Quinn brand. The original cabin still stood, though it was used mainly for storage now. Owen had refused to tear it down. "That cabin is where our life together started," he said whenever Dahlia suggested removing it. "It stays." Matthew graduated from the small school in Lusk at 16 and announced he wanted to go east for further education. "I want to study agriculture and business," he said. "I want to learn new methods, new ideas, and bring them back to help improve the ranch." Owen was hesitant, not wanting to lose his youngest son to the east, but Dahlia encouraged it. "Let him go and learn. He will come back. This land is in his blood." Matthew left for a college in Illinois in the fall of 1895, and the house felt emptier without his irrepressible energy. But he wrote long letters describing his studies, his excitement about new breeding techniques and business practices, and Dahlia knew Owen had been right to let him go. By 1896, Dahlia and Owen had 5 grandchildren, with more on the way. The ranch house was always full of noise and activity, children running through the halls, family gathering for Sunday dinners that required 3 tables pushed together to seat everyone. Dahlia cooked with her daughters-in-law, teaching them her recipes, listening to their concerns and joys, welcoming them fully into the family. One evening in December, as snow fell softly outside and the house glowed with lamplight and the sound of family, Owen found Dahlia standing in the doorway of the parlor, watching their grandchildren play on the floor while James and Thomas discussed cattle prices, and Sarah and Clara planned a quilting bee. "What are you thinking?" Owen asked, sliding an arm around her waist, a gesture as natural now as breathing. "I am thinking about that December night 20 years ago," Dahlia said, "when you reached for my hand across that bed, when everything changed." "I think about that night too," Owen admitted. "How terrified I was that you would pull away, how grateful I was when you did not. I could never have pulled away from you. I knew even then, though I was not ready to admit it, that you were what I had been looking for all my life. Not just shelter from the storm, but a home, a partner, a love that would last." Owen turned her in his arms so they were facing each other. At 51, he was graying at the temples, his face more lined, but to Dahlia he was as handsome as the day she met him. Perhaps more so, because every line was a story they had lived together, every gray hair a year they had survived and thrived. "I love you," Owen said. "I have loved you for 20 years, and I will love you for 20 more and 20 after that if we are blessed with the time." "I love you too," Dahlia replied. "Everything I am, everything I have become is because you gave me the chance to find myself again. You saw me at my lowest and decided I was worth saving. You saved yourself. I just provided the shelter. Everything else, all of this, you built it with me." Their grandson, Owen James, toddled over, demanding to be picked up, and Owen swept the 2-year-old into his arms with practiced ease. The boy laughed and grabbed at Owen's nose, and Dahlia felt such a surge of love and contentment that tears sprang to her eyes. This was what she had nearly lost in the snow that terrible day. Not just her own life, but all of these future lives, this family that sprang from tragedy and chance, and one cowboy's decision to stop and help. If Owen had ridden past, if he had decided she was not his problem, none of this would exist. James would never have been born. The twins would never have existed. Matthew would never have gone east to study. The grandchildren playing at her feet would never have drawn breath, but Owen had stopped. He had taken her in, and in doing so, he had given her not just life but a reason to live. Matthew returned from college in 1898, full of ideas and enthusiasm. He immediately began implementing new breeding programs and accounting systems, bringing a modern approach that complemented Owen's traditional methods perfectly. The ranch prospered even more under their combined management. "You were right to let him go," Owen told Dahlia. "He came back better than he left." "Our children always do what they are meant to do," Dahlia replied. "We raise them to think for themselves and to value family. The combination keeps them grounded but reaching." In 1900, as the new century dawned, the Quinn family gathered to celebrate both the turn of the century and Owen and Dahlia's 25th anniversary. It was Grace who organized it, bringing everyone together at the ranch for a week of festivities. The house overflowed with children and grandchildren, now numbering 8 with one more on the way. On the evening of their actual anniversary, after the big party with neighbors and friends, after the children had been put to bed and the house had finally quieted, Owen took Dahlia's hand and led her outside into the December snow. "Where are we going?" she asked, laughing. "You will see." He led her to the old cabin, the one they had refused to tear down. He had brought a lantern, and inside she saw that he had cleaned it, furnished it with a simple pallet of blankets near a small fire he had already started in the old stove. "I thought we could spend tonight here," Owen said. Where it all began. Dahlia looked around the small space that had been her entire world that first winter. It looked so much smaller than she remembered, but also so precious. "This is perfect." They lay down on the pallet, and Owen pulled her close, arranging them just as they had been that first night, her back to his chest, his arm around her waist. But this time there was no hesitation, no careful distance. They fit together perfectly, two pieces that had been separate and were now one. "Do you remember how scared I was?" Owen asked quietly. "How certain I was that I would do something wrong, say something wrong, ruin everything." "I remember being just as scared," Dahlia admitted. "I had lost everything. I was so broken, and you were so kind, and I did not know how to accept kindness without suspicion. I reached for you anyway, and I took your hand, best decision I ever made." They lay in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind outside, the crackle of the fire, the familiar sounds of winter. Dahlia thought about all the years that had passed, all the seasons that had turned, all the moments of joy and sorrow and ordinary contentment that had woven together to create their life. "Are you happy?" Owen asked, the same question he had asked countless times over the years. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Dahlia replied, the same answer she always gave because it was always true. "Good," Owen said, and she felt him smile against her hair. "Then I have done what I set out to do." "What was that? Give you a reason to stay?" Dahlia turned in his arms so she could see his face in the lamplight. "Owen Quinn, you gave me 1,000 reasons to stay. 1,000,000. Every day we have spent together has been another reason." Owen kissed her, still with the same tenderness he had shown that first time, but now mixed with the confidence and familiarity of 25 years of marriage. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "Here is to 25 more," he said. "At least," Dahlia agreed. They returned to the big house the next morning to find it in happy chaos, grandchildren running everywhere, their children cooking breakfast and arguing good-naturedly about who was in charge. Clara was trying to corral 3 children at once while pregnant with her 4th. James was deep in conversation with Matthew about the spring breeding schedule. Grace had arrived early with her family, and her 2 daughters were helping Sarah set the table. It was loud and messy and occasionally frustrating, and Dahlia loved every moment of it. The years continued to pass, bringing changes both welcome and challenging. Owen's father-in-law Henry passed in 1902, followed by James's wife Sarah's mother the next year. The losses reminded them all of the precious nature of time, of the importance of gathering while they could. In 1905, James took over the majority of the ranch operations, with Owen stepping into more of an advisory role. It was hard for Owen to let go at first, but Dahlia reminded him that this was what they had been building toward all along. "Let him lead," she said. "You trained him well, and you have earned the right to rest a little." "Rest," Owen repeated skeptically. "I am 56, not 80. "Then think of it as shifting your focus. Spend more time with your grandchildren. Teach them what you know. That is just as important as running the ranch." Owen took her advice, and soon he could be found most afternoons with a grandchild or 3 trailing after him, learning to rope, to read animal tracks, to understand weather and seasons and the rhythms of ranch life. He was patient with them in a way he never could have imagined being in his youth, and watching him transform into a gentle grandfather gave Dahlia a joy that somehow exceeded even the joy of seeing him as a father. Their children married and had children of their own. The ranch compound grew to include 5 houses, all connected by well-worn paths, all part of the Quinn legacy. Grace's oldest daughter went to college and became a teacher like her mother. Clara's son showed promise as a horse trainer. Matthew married a woman from Illinois and brought her back to the ranch, where she fit in as perfectly as if she had been born there. By 1910, Owen and Dahlia had 14 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. The big house was still the center of family life, with Sunday dinners that required cooking for 24 people or more. Dahlia taught her granddaughters to cook and sew, passing down recipes and techniques her own mother had taught her. Owen taught his grandsons to ranch, but also to read and to think, to question and to learn. "We are building a dynasty," James joked one Sunday, looking around at the crowd of Quinns gathered in the house. "We are building a family," Dahlia corrected. "There is a difference." In December of 1910, on the 30th anniversary of that night when Owen first reached for Dahlia's hand, they held another gathering. But this one was smaller, just their immediate children and their spouses, a quiet evening of reminiscence and gratitude. "Tell us the story," Grace asked. "Tell us again how you met." Dahlia and Owen exchanged glances, and Owen gestured for her to start. She had told this story dozens of times, but it never got old. "It was the worst day of my life," she began, and watched her children lean in, even though they knew every word. "I had just lost everything. Your father's horse had been shot, my first husband had been killed by outlaws, and I was lying in the mud in a snowstorm, certain I was going to die. And then your father rode up out of nowhere, like something out of a storybook, and he saved my life." "Not quite like a storybook," Owen interjected. "I was grumpy and half-frozen myself. I probably looked more like a bear than a hero." "You looked perfect to me," Dahlia said. You looked like hope. Grace wiped at her eyes. And then what? And then he brought me here to that cabin and he gave me shelter. He let me stay even though he had no reason to help a stranger. He was kind when he could have been cruel, patient when he could have been demanding. He gave me time to heal. She made me a shirt for Christmas. Owen picked up the story. The first gift anyone had given me in years. And I realized I did not want her to leave when spring came. I wanted her to stay forever. But I was too stubborn to admit I wanted to stay, Dahlia continued. We spent 6 months sleeping on opposite sides of the bed, both of us too proud or too scared to acknowledge what we felt. Until that night in December, James said, prompting the favorite part. Until that night in December, Owen agreed. There was a blizzard, the worst one that winter. We were both freezing and Dahlia suggested we share warmth. Just practical, she said. It was practical, Dahlia protested, laughing. It was you being brave enough to say what we both wanted but were too afraid to ask for. So I reached across that bed, and I took your hand, and I pulled you close. And I knew in that moment that I was never going to let you go. And he never has, Dahlia finished softly. 30 years, and he has never once let me go. Their children were quiet for a moment, caught up in the romance of the story they had heard so many times. Then Matthew raised his glass. To Mom and Dad, he said. For showing us what love looks like, what partnership looks like, what building a life together really means. To Mom and Dad, the others echoed, and Dahlia felt Owen's hand find hers under the table, their fingers lacing together as naturally as breathing. Later that night, after everyone had gone home to their own houses, Dahlia and Owen stood on the porch of the house they had built, looking out over the ranch that sprawled in all directions. Lights glowed from the other houses scattered across the property, each one holding a piece of their family, their legacy. We did well, Owen said quietly, better than I ever dreamed possible. We did, Dahlia agreed, but we are not done yet. No. Owen looked at her curiously. No. We still have years ahead of us, more grandchildren to meet, more memories to make, more December nights where you can reach for my hand. Owen pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her from behind just as he had countless times over the years. I will always reach for you, he said. Every night for the rest of our lives. Promise? Dahlia asked, though she already knew the answer. Promise, Owen said and kissed the top of her head. They stood like that for a long time, watching the stars come out over the Wyoming plains, feeling the cold December wind, and knowing that they were exactly where they belonged. The world had changed enormously in the 30 years since that terrible day when Dahlia's first husband was killed. Wyoming had become a state, towns had grown, railroads had spread. The wild frontier of their youth was becoming something more civilized, more settled, but some things never changed. The land was still harsh and beautiful. The work was still hard. And the love between them was still as strong as it had been that first night when Owen reached across a frozen bed and Dahlia took his hand. That love had built all of this. The houses, the children, the legacy. But more than that, it had built two people who had been broken and lost into something whole and found. It had taken two separate lives and woven them together into something richer and more beautiful than either could have been alone. As they finally went inside out of the cold, Dahlia looked back once more at the original cabin, barely visible in the darkness. That little building had been the crucible where their love was forged, where two frightened, damaged people had learned to trust again, to hope again, to love again. Thank you, she said softly. For what? Owen asked. For stopping that day. For taking a chance on a stranger. For reaching for my hand when I needed it most. Owen cupped her face in his work-roughened hands, the same gesture he had used 1,000 times, and looked into her eyes. Dahlia, you were never a stranger. From the moment I saw you in that snow, you were mine. I just had to wait for you to realize it too. I love you, she said, the 3 words that had sustained them through 3 decades, that would sustain them through however many more they were granted. I love you too, Owen replied. Always have. Always will. They went to bed in the large, comfortable room they had shared for years, so different from that first winter in the tiny cabin. But as Owen reached for her across the bed, as Dahlia moved into his arms, it felt exactly the same as that first December night. The same warmth, the same comfort, the same sense of coming home. Outside, the snow fell softly over the Quinn ranch, covering everything in a blanket of white. Inside, 2 people who had found each other in the coldest, darkest moment of their lives held each other close and dreamed of all the tomorrows still to come. The years that followed were gentler than the years of building had been. Owen and Dahlia settled into a comfortable rhythm of grandparenting and support, still active but no longer bearing the weight of running the ranch day to day. James proved to be an excellent manager, with Matthew's business acumen complementing his practical experience perfectly. The ranch continued to prosper, weathering economic downturns that destroyed other operations. In 1915, as the world outside began its descent into war, the Quinn Ranch remained an island of peace. Grace's son Thomas enlisted despite his mother's fears, and the family gathered to send him off, hoping he would return safely. The war felt distant from the Wyoming plains, but its effects rippled even to them, in the form of changing beef prices and labor shortages. Owen was 66 now, his hair completely gray, his movements slower but still sure. Dahlia was 63, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face lined but still beautiful in Owen's eyes. They had been married for 35 years, together for 36, and they moved around each other with the practiced ease of a lifetime of partnership. One day, in early December of 1916, Owen collapsed while helping to repair a fence. James and Matthew carried him back to the house and the doctor was summoned from Lusk. Dahlia sat beside Owen's bed holding his hand while the doctor examined him. His heart, the doctor said quietly. It is weakening. He needs rest, complete rest, no more physical labor. Owen protested, but Dahlia shushed him. You heard the doctor. You are going to rest, and you are going to let our sons handle the ranch. I am not an invalid, Owen grumbled. No, you are a stubborn old man who needs to accept that he is not 25 anymore. But Dahlia's voice was gentle, and her hand never left his. Owen recovered from that episode, but he was never quite the same. He tired more easily, and Dahlia watched him carefully, afraid of losing him after all these years. They spent more time together, taking slow walks around the property, sitting on the porch in the sunshine, talking about the past and the future. Are you afraid? Dahlia asked him one afternoon as they sat together watching the grandchildren play. Of dying, Owen considered this. No, not really. I have had a good life. A better life than I ever thought possible. When my time comes, I will go content. Do not talk like that, Dahlia said, her voice sharp with fear. Owen took her hand. Dahlia, we are both getting old. We need to talk about these things. I know. I just do not want to imagine a world without you in it. Then do not imagine it. Just be here with me now in this moment. That is all any of us ever have. Dahlia leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat like that for a long time, comfortable in the silence they had learned to share over the years. Thomas returned from the war in 1919, changed by what he had seen but alive and whole. The family celebrated his homecoming with joy and relief, another reminder of how precious each day was. The war had taken so many young men. That Thomas had been spared felt like a gift. In 1920, On their 40th anniversary, the family threw another grand celebration. Owen was 71 now, Dahlia 68, and they presided over a gathering of more than 50 people, all family, all descended from their union or married into it. 4 generations of Quinns filled the house and spilled out into the yard, and Dahlia looked around at all of them with a sense of profound accomplishment. "We did this," she said to Owen as they danced slowly to music played on a gramophone James had bought. "All of these people exist because you stopped to help a stranger in the snow." "We did this together," Owen corrected. "I may have stopped, but you chose to stay. You chose to build this with me." That night, after everyone had gone home or been settled in guest rooms, Owen and Dahlia lay in bed together, and Owen said, "I want to go back to the cabin one more time." "Now?" Dahlia asked. "It is nearly midnight." "Now," Owen confirmed. "Please." They bundled up against the December cold and walked slowly to the old cabin. Owen had to stop and rest twice. His breathing labored, and Dahlia's worry spiked, but he insisted on completing the journey. Inside, the cabin was dusty and unused, but Owen had apparently prepared for this. There was wood laid in the stove and a lantern ready to light. "You planned this," Dahlia accused gently. "I wanted to spend one more night here, where it all began. Is that all right?" Dahlia felt tears prick her eyes. "Of course it is all right." They lit the fire and the lantern, and Owen spread blankets on the floor where the bed had once been. They lay down together, and Owen pulled Dahlia close, arranging them as they had been that first time and so many times since. "I am glad I reached for you," Owen said quietly. "That night, 40 years ago, I almost did not. I was so afraid you would reject me, but I did it anyway, and it changed everything." "I am glad you did too," Dahlia said, feeling tears slip down her temples. "You gave me a life, Owen. You gave me everything." They lay like that for hours, talking softly about the past, about their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, about the ranch and the life they had built. As dawn began to break, Owen said, "I am tired, Dahlia, so tired." "Then sleep," she said, tightening her arms around him. "I am right here. I am not going anywhere." Owen's breathing slowed, deepened, and Dahlia held him as he drifted off. She stayed awake, memorizing the feel of him in her arms, the sound of his breathing, the warmth of his body against hers. She knew, somehow, that this was important, this moment. That it might be the last moment like this they would have. As the sun rose fully, spilling golden light through the cabin window, Dahlia whispered, "I love you, Owen Quinn. I love you more than words can say. Thank you for giving me a life worth living. Thank you for seeing me when I was lost and helping me find my way. Thank you for being my home." Owen stirred slightly, and she thought he murmured something that might have been "love you too," but she could not be certain. She held him closer and closed her own eyes, letting herself drift into sleep, wrapped in the warmth of 4 decades of love. When James came looking for them hours later, worried when they did not appear for breakfast, he found them together in the old cabin, lying on the blankets in each other's arms. Dahlia woke when he touched her shoulder, but Owen did not. He had slipped away quietly in his sleep, held by the woman he loved in the place where their story had begun. The grief was profound. Dahlia felt as though a piece of her soul had been torn away. But even through the tears, she knew she had been blessed. 40 years with Owen Quinn was more than many people got in a lifetime. They had built a love that had transformed them both, that had created a legacy that would endure for generations. At Owen's funeral, attended by what seemed like half of Wyoming, Dahlia stood straight and dry-eyed as the preacher spoke of Owen's life, his contributions to the community, his devotion to his family. She spoke the eulogy herself, her voice steady, telling the story one more time of the cowboy who had stopped to help a stranger and ended up finding everything he never knew he needed. "Owen was not a man of many words," she said, looking out at the sea of faces. "But he was a man of action, of steady devotion, of unwavering love. He showed me what it meant to truly partner with someone, to build a life based on mutual respect and affection. He was my rescuer, my husband, my best friend, and the love of my life. I will miss him every day for the rest of my days, but I will never regret a single moment we spent together." She lived for 8 more years, long enough to see the ranch continue to thrive under James and Matthew's management, long enough to meet 15 more great-grandchildren, long enough to see the grandchildren she had helped raise become parents and grandparents themselves. She spent those years telling stories, making sure every Quinn child knew the history of the ranch, the story of how it had all begun. She wrote it all down in careful script, creating a family history that would be passed down through the generations. She wanted them to understand that everything they had came from a single act of kindness, from one man's decision to stop and help, and from 2 broken people who learned to heal each other. On a December evening in 1928, Dahlia died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 76. Her family buried her next to Owen on the hill overlooking the ranch, beneath a large stone that read, "Dahlia and Owen Quinn, together always." The ranch continued, just as they had planned. James's son took over when James retired, and his son after him. The Quinn name became synonymous with quality beef and good land management throughout Wyoming. The original cabin was preserved and eventually designated a historical site, a testament to the pioneers who had settled the West and built lives from nothing. But more than the ranch, more than the land, what endured was the story. Every generation of Quinns grew up hearing about the cowboy who saved a woman in a snowstorm, about 6 cold months sleeping on opposite sides of a bed, about the December night when he finally reached for her hand and changed both their lives forever. It became a legend within the family, a reminder of what love could be when it was built on friendship and respect, on patience and kindness, on the simple act of reaching out to someone in need. Young Quinn brides and grooms were told the story on their wedding days, reminded that marriage was not just passion but partnership, not just romance but the daily choice to reach for each other, even when it was hard. The original homestead land expanded to several thousand acres over the decades, supporting dozens of family members and employing scores of ranch hands. But at its heart, it remained what Owen and Dahlia had built together, a place of refuge, of family, of love. And on cold December nights, when snow fell softly over the Wyoming plains, the Quinns still told the story of their great-great-grandparents, of a woman who lost everything and a man who had nothing to lose, of a tiny cabin and a hard winter, and 2 people who learned to share warmth before they learned to share love, of a cowboy who reached across a cold bed for a woman's hand, and in doing so, created something that would last forever. The story lived on, passed from parent to child, from grandparent to grandchild, a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come from the darkest moments. That sometimes the greatest love stories start not with passion but with simple human kindness. That sometimes all it takes to change the world is one person willing to reach out their hand in the darkness and another person brave enough to take it. And in that old cabin, preserved now as a museum piece, visitors could still see the small space where it all happened. They could stand where Owen and Dahlia once stood, imagine the cold winters and the shared blankets and the gradual warming that happened between 2 lonely hearts. They could read the plaques that told the basic facts of the story, but the real story, the one that mattered, lived in the hearts of the Quinn family. It lived in the way they treated each other, in the way they welcomed strangers, in the way they believed in second chances, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. It lived in every hand reached out in kindness, in every person who chose to help when they could have looked away, in every couple who learned that true love was not found but built, day by day, choice by choice, reach by reach. And on quiet December evenings, when the snow fell and the wind howled around the old ranch buildings, some swore they could still feel the presence of Owen and Dahlia Quinn, walking the land they loved, checking on the family they created, satisfied with the legacy they left behind. A legacy that began with tragedy and transformed into triumph. A legacy that proved love could conquer loss, that partnership could overcome hardship, that two broken people could create something beautiful and whole. A legacy that started the moment a cowboy reached for a woman's hand one cold December night, and she reached back,